Hello everyone, this is Prem Kumar. Welcome to this video on basic authentication. I have started a new playlist in YouTube which will hold all the advanced Pega concepts. This will be the first video in that playlist. I like to start this video by explaining about authentication. I hope everyone is aware of the term authentication, right? Authentication is like identifying oneself. If you take any applications, usually those applications, they'll be having some kind of authentication mechanism to identify the application users. You can take our usual example of Facebook. If you want to use Facebook application, definitely you have to identify yourself. You have to provide the username and password that will be validated against the Facebook data center. Once successfully validated, the user will be successfully authenticated and he or she can use the Facebook application. When I talk about providing the username and password, this can be considered as a basic authentication. There can be other types of authentication also. For example, you can use the single sign-on authentication. You can also use the multi-factor authentication where you can get some OTP on your phone number which can provide additional security features. At the end, authentication is going to provide you the security. It's going to check your ID card and say you are a valid person and then it will let you in. Now let's talk about the authentication in Pega. We already know that to access a Pega application, everyone should be authenticated. Whether it can be an end user or can be a developer, he or she should be authenticated before using the Pega application. So how does this authentication flow works? Let's again take a basic example. Let's say an end user, he wants to use the Pega application. What he can do is, he can go to the login page, provide the username and password details, and from there, the authentication flow can kick in. So how this authentication flow starts is, as soon as the end user clicks on login button, we can use different authentication protocols. As you see in the picture, you see it supports basic authentication, which is just the username and password. It supports LDAP, OAuth, SAML, and also OpenID protocols. Why do we need all these protocols? If you think on any big organization, they will have their own identity management system. It means all the employees' details can be stored in a separate data center. You can have an LDAP directory or different directory services that can hold all these details. So if you want to validate any user, you have to validate against that identity management system. And different identity management system, they support different types of protocol. You can use this LDAP protocol. You can also use this OAuth protocol to connect to the identity system and provide the necessary details to validate any end user. And as you see in the picture, Pega out of the box, they support all these different protocols. It means all you have to do is do some little configuration on the right URLs and right certificates. And once you are done, you will be successfully able to use all these different protocols in your authentication. So as I told, authentication protocols helps to identify with the identity management, or it can be also identity providers. There are a lot of identity providers available in the market. You can go for Okta, you can go for Microsoft Azure AD. You can also use the OpenID. These identity providers can act like an identity management system that can hold the entities for the end users or the users who wants to use the applications. We will go much in detail about these authentication protocols and these identity providers in the coming videos. In this video, I am going to concentrate only on this basic authentication where Pega uses the out-of-the-box PR_operators table which stays into the Pega's database. All those user details are stored into the database, and basic authentication, it validates against the details that are stored into the Pega's database. Now the next step is how the end user or developer can access the Pega server. We have a launch URL or a login URL which they can use. Usually it will be of host name, port name, and then you have that context name which defines the application PR web. And then you can also use the URL pattern that defines the servlet name. As you see in the picture, localhost is my host, 8088 is my port, and then PR web is the context, or it is the application context. As you know, different applications can be deployed into this Tomcat localhost server, and currently I want to launch the URL of the Pega web application. That is why you see the name PR web that defines the context of your application. After that, you see some URL pattern that can point to some servlet name. So what is servlet name here? Servlet it's like a Java program that runs on the server. The main job of servlet is to respond to incoming requests, and it can construct the responses. So where do all these servlet definitions are configured? It is configured into the web.xml file of your application. The next thing, what is web.xml file? So web.xml file, as you see here, it is the deployment descriptor of your application. It can contain different kind of servlet definitions and the mappings. Servlet definition, here you can define type of engine code that should be invoked whenever you get some incoming request to the servlet. And servlet mapping, it helps to map an URL template to the servlet name. We will see about this web.xml shortly in this video. Okay, now that we know servlets are defined into the web.xml. Are these really sufficient to implement any kind of authentication service in Pega? No, there is also one more rule. We call it as authentication service rule in Pega. This rule, it helps with the authentication mechanism. As I told, Pega supports different protocols out of the box, and you can configure all those protocols in the authentication service rule. Okay, now how all these gets interconnected? We'll also see it very shortly. Before that, let's check up some of the changes that happened with the 8.2 version. The first big change is the introduction of new authentication service, that is the platform authentication. If you go before 8.1, when you want to use some kind of basic authentication, it all comes out of the box. You cannot create a new authentication service, or you don't have any new authentication service for the basic authentication. It is all buried under the engine code. All you can see is you will have a servlet that is defined into the web.xml alone. So new requirements comes in. For example, in basic authentication, you don't want to use the Pega's database. Instead, you want to use a different data store. In those cases, before 8.1, it's very difficult to customize the basic authentication. But with 8.2, Pega introduced this new authentication service instance. We call it as platform authentication, that can be easily customized. Platform authentication is all about the basic authentication which you use with username and password. The next big change is the introduction of new servlet, the PR auth servlet. The role of PR auth servlet is to provide a base authentication layer where different authentication services can extend this PR auth. What I meant here is, before 8.1, whenever you want to use some kind of custom authentication service, or like if you want to use SAML authentication service, then definitely you have to do all those changes into the web.xml file. Now, after 8.2, Pega already defined in the web.xml a reference or a servlet of PR auth. So whatever authentication service that extends this PR auth is already defined into the web.xml. So when you create a new authentication service, it is not necessary to update the web.xml every time and restart the server. Instead, you can just go ahead and create everything into Pega, and everything will work out of the box easily. As you see in the below URL, the URL construct can be localhost, port name, PRWeb, the context, PR auth, the servlet name, and then it can use Pega for the platform authentication. Or if you create any other authentication service, it can use the service alias in the URL construct. Important thing to note is PR auth doesn't work for the custom authentication or for the Kerberos authentication. And for backward compatibility, still the old servlets are used. The old servlet, what I meant here is the PR servlet name. That URL will still work, and that uses the basic authentication. I hope you got some introduction about this. Now let's see it in practical, how these URL constructs are formed and how these servlets are defined into the web.xml. For now, I just launched the login URL by using this old servlet, the PR servlet. If I just refresh, I get the login page, right? Now let's go ahead and change the servlet from PR servlet into PR auth, which is the new servlet that is introduced as part of 8.2. I'm going to say PR auth here. Let's check what page it renders. Again, it renders the login page. Okay, now both little bit work the same. PR servlet is for backward compatibility, and PR auth, it is also rendering me the login page. So how does all these things works? If I give a different URL template, it is finding me the right servlet and it is rendering me the login page always. Let's check the configuration from the web.xml. To access web.xml, you need to go to the folder in which you install the Pega Personal Edition. I installed it onto my C drive. So I'm going there, PRPC Personal Edition, go to Tomcat, Web Apps, and then PR Web, Webinf. Under that, you will find Web.xml. Just open it in one of your editor. Here you see different servlet definitions. It all starts with web standard servlet definition, and under that you also find the servlet class and the engine class which is going to invoke. If you just collapse this servlet, you can scroll down to find different servlets that are configured. Some for secure authentication, some for LDAP, some for SSO, and definitely we will also have a servlet configuration that is defined for PR auth. Let's check it out. And you see here on the 682 line, you find a servlet definition for PR auth. It also uses an engine class with authentication type as Pega authentication. Okay, now we know that different servlet definitions have defined. One for web standard, it can be for the engine Pega basic authentication, and PR auth, which is a new servlet name. Now where do these URLs gets mapped to the servlet name? You have a servlet mapping here. If you scroll little down, you will find the URL pattern and the servlet name to which it gets mapped to. So whenever you referred some PR servlet or PR servlet, after that you can follow with any kind of junk character. It always routes to the servlet name web standard, which is the engine code Pega authentication. Before 8.2 version, you have this as a basic authentication. Now you can also scroll down to find the PR auth mapping. If you scroll little further here, you will find the URL pattern for PR auth. You see PR auth slash then a while character. So whatever comes after PR auth will always gets routed to the servlet name. As I told before, now different authentication services, they extend this URL pattern PR auth and then they form the name here, so that all those authentication services will automatically route to this servlet name PR auth. That is what we defined in the servlet mapping, and then it goes to the servlet definition and uses the engine code to execute the authentication mechanism. Again, before 8.2 versions, if you want to use some kind of SSO or SAML authentication, whatever authentication you want to use, you have to make an entry into this web.xml. But with 8.2, we can always extend this PR auth, which is already defined in the web.xml. So all you have to do is create the authentication service from Pega. Now let's go to Pega and check the Pega's out-of-the-box platform authentication service. Here I'm just logging in with my username password. So what you see here is it applied some kind of security policy and it is asking me to change the password. How does this happen? Because before, whenever I tried to log in, I never prompted with changing the password. The first main reason is because I'm using PR auth servlet. So there is some kind of security policy that is associated with the PR auth servlet. We will find it out. For now, I don't want to change my password. So what I can do is I'm going to remove all this other servlet and I will use the backward compatible server PR servlet. Now this will give me a login page. Let's try to find out by logging in. If I try to log in, I'm sure it is not going to ask me to change the password because security policies are not associated with this backward compatible engine basic authentication. As you see, Pega Dev Studio is just launching. Now let's go to the authentication service. For that, you can go to records, sysadmin, and under sysadmin, you will find the authentication service. Open that. There you will find list of authentication services. One such important authentication service is the platform authentication service, which was introduced as part of 8.2 version. Let's open the platform authentication service. If you are older than 8.2 version, you will not find any type of basic credentials authentication service. But with 8.2, Pega introduced this platform authentication. Under this platform authentication, you can see the login URL as PR auth and then it extends Pega, which is the service alias name. So Pega is the service alias name and automatically it appended here. Okay, now let's check the security policy. As you can see, there is some kind of password security policy is there, captcha security policy is there, lockout security policy is there. We'll see more about security policy in a different lecture, but if you are interested, you can go here and find the security policies. All you have to do is go to configure, org and security, authentication, and then security policies. You'll find different types of security policies. And this authentication service is using 3 security policies on password, captcha, and lockout. That is why I was prompted to change my password because I used PR auth. So I use the PR auth servlet. Now if I try to use this URL, again it's going to ask me to change the password. Let me try it out. If I use frame rules, definitely the password security policy should be invoked and you should be asking me to change the password. Let's check it out. Yes, of course it is doing it. I will close this and you see this is the login URL for the platform authentication. As I told, PR auth is kind of a generic layer from where different authentication services can extend. Now let's create another authentication service extending this PR auth. I'm going to create a new authentication service. I just want to see how this login page is rendered. Currently, there is only one platform authentication under PR auth. Now if I try to create one more authentication service, I'll just create it as test for now and I'll create it as type SAML 2.0. Just create and open. Here I'm going to provide the authentication service alias as test, and just to fill the mandatory configuration, entity identification, I'll just say again test. Login URL, we'll just put some valid URL here. Logout and all is not mandatory. And then you can say name identifier is fine. Then service provider settings. Here you should disable the record settings. Now if you go back and just fill the description because it validates, I'll just put test. Now do a save. Now what we did here is we created a new authentication service. Let's check the URL of this new authentication service. Go to SAML 2.0. Here you see the login URL is extending PR auth / the test, which is the authentication service alias. Now let's launch this login page of PR auth. Let's see how it behaves. I'm going to open a new window. Just launch it. There you will find the login page is little customized, giving you different options because we have enabled two types of authentication here. One is the platform authentication, which is enabled by default, and we also introduced a new authentication, which is login with test. Now if you go to this authentication service and disable this, just do a disable and save. Once you disable, you can try to launch the PR's auth again. Now let's check the login page. You will not find the disabled authentication service. Currently you see only the platform authentication, which is enabled. Now let's get back to the platform authentication. And from here, you can see it provides different functionalities. Just like a normal authentication service, with 8.2, you can verify the credentials against external identity store. It means you can use a data page that can connect to a different system and then it can validate the username and password. So by here, you are not restricted to use only the username password that is stored into the Pega database, but you can also use the external identity store. You can also use the operator identification where you can say enable operator provisioning using model operator. It means it can create a new operator on the fly. So when an end user logs in first, and if that operator is successfully validated in an external identity store, then you can create a new operator ID in Pega. Definitely you need to have an operator ID in Pega to access application. But when you launch the URL and if it's a valid user and if an operator ID is not found in the Pega database, we can of course create the operator on the fly. There are also other advanced configurations like you can do pre-authentication, post-authentication activity. You can also do some kind of other external mapping. You can include the security policies with these authentication services. By this way, even for basic authentication, you can enable different authentication service features. Okay, now before ending this video, I want to explain you how Pega's out-of-the-box activities can help with the authentication mechanism. If I enter a username password here, it validates the details against my Pega's database operator table, right? How does that happen? Let's check it out. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to trace this session. You can trace any browser sessions in your server. So to do that, you can use the remote tracer, go to the tracer, and then from here, you can use the remote tracer. All you have to do is find the right browser requester session. As you can see, there is one browser session, which is my current operator where I logged in. There is another browser session, which I just launched and I never logged in. So I'm going to trace that browser session. Just do a OK here. So this will trace up the new browser session. Now let's go to that session, which is under incognito, and then I'm going to log in with my username password. As soon as you log in, the tracer should be capturing the activities that are responsible for the login. As you see, all are out of the box Pega's activity. It means the out of the box rules is responsible to do this basic authentication. Okay, now my tracer is stopped. You can expand this and scroll down to find different activities that gets invoked. It all starts with update operator ID. There is some kind of update happening, and you see initial profile setup. It is doing some profile setup for the operator. So some clipboard pages will be created for this operator requester session, and all these are out of the box thing. Application is getting set up, requester is getting initialized. You can see all this getting used for setting up an operator session. If you provide a wrong password here, Pega will validate it against this DB table, and then it will prompt you or it will throw you some kind of error. Now we are almost at the end of this video. A small sneak peek to the next video. How do we customize this login screen? Can we really do that? Because Pega's out of the box engine takes care of all these authentication mechanism as well as presenting this login screen. So definitely in any organization, they need some kind of customized login screen, right? They don't need this Pega logo. Instead, they may need their own organizational logo there. Definitely we can do it. We need to have some kind of unauthenticated rule set. From there, we can customize the out of the box UI rules, and then we can do our necessary changes. We will see it during the next video. See you soon.